Was John Calvin responsible for the execution of Michael Servetus? Well, partially. This is the claim that Frans van Stam makes in his book The Servetus Case. Hello, my name is Fariba. I have a PhD in French literature, and I research the Reformation and the French Wars of Religion. When John Calvin first arrived in Geneva in 1536, the city was already Protestant. The Mass had been abolished by the Grand Council on August 10, 1535, and over the next year, the Genevans increasingly demonstrated their allegiance to the so-called Lutheran cause. Calvin was far from the only authoritative voice on reformed matters in the city. He quickly entered into conflict with other leaders who had different goals for the church in Geneva. This conflict led to his brief exile in Strasbourg between 1538 and 1541. However, once Calvin returned to Geneva, the consistory, that is, the institution responsible for overseeing doctrine and morality in Geneva, set to work to implement Calvin's vision throughout the city, not without resistance from inside and outside the other councils. Frans van Stam insists that it is against this background of confessional and even nationalistic conflict that we must understand the Servetus affair. Genevans were upset by the sudden influx of French immigrants and resented that these foreigners had such a hold on the Genevan church. Calvin first pursued Servetus while he was working as a physician in Vienne, in France. Servetus was one of those quintessential Renaissance men who dabbled in several disciplines, including medicine, theology, astronomy, geography, and even poetry. In 1531, he wrote a book against the Trinity called De Trinitatis Erroribus, and it was immediately investigated by the Inquisition. To avoid further censor, Servetus changed his name to Michel de Villeneuve and moved to Paris, and then later to Vienne. Although Protestants and Catholics disagreed on several doctrinal points, they agreed on the Trinity. In a way, the Servetus affair illustrates the dictum, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." The Reformed in Geneva made common cause with the Catholics in France over this one point. Well, two actually, infant baptism being the other one. Opposition to infant baptism threatened both the Catholics and the magisterial Protestants. In Zurich and several German city-states, the Anabaptists had been pursued as revolutionaries who threatened to destroy the social order. To many, opposition to infant baptism recalled the German Peasants' War and the subsequent and very violent Münster Rebellion. Neither the Catholics nor the Protestants were about to tolerate an Anabaptist, especially one who called the Trinity a three-headed Cerberus. Servetus also believed that Jesus' human nature differed fundamentally from our own. So those are the theological reasons for Calvin's opposition to Servetus, but what about the political reasons? Frans van Stam notes that Calvin first pursued Servetus in an effort to save 5 Reformed missionaries. These were students or écoliers in Lyon. Calvin figured that if he showed the French inquisitor that Servetus was a greater danger to Catholic orthodoxy than the 5 students, he would drop the case against them and pursue Servetus instead. When that did not work, the students were eventually burned at the stake, and Servetus arrived in Geneva, Calvin feared that Servetus would accuse him of having helped the Inquisition in France. Calvin also feared, rightly so, that his opponents in Geneva would use Servetus against him and against the consistory. So Calvin's men brought a list of accusations to the council showing how dangerous Servetus' views were to the church. Now here's where it gets interesting. Genevan law required accusers to be imprisoned along with the accused until preliminary investigations proved that the accusations were legitimate. If the lieutenant in charge of these preliminary investigations discovered that the accuser raised false accusations, the accuser would suffer the same punishment that the accused would have received. So naturally, Calvin did not personally bring his accusations against Servetus to the council, but got another minister to do this. This man was imprisoned along with Servetus until the preliminary investigations proved that, indeed, Servetus was guilty of the alleged charges. Once that was done, and Calvin's man was released, the council asked Calvin to send over a list of accusations. Then Servetus had the opportunity to respond, and Calvin was given the last word. He could respond to Servetus's response. But after this, the council took over the investigation. So it was ultimately the council's prosecutor who condemned Servetus. Even so, Frans van Stam demonstrates that Calvin used his contacts in Zurich and Basel to funnel the right information to the council. On October 27, 1553, Michael Servetus was burned at the stake along with his books. Shortly afterward, Calvin wrote a defense of the council's decision to prove to his confessional opponents that he was of one mind with the council. This was important because Calvin's opponents believed that the council should have more authority than the consistory. So with Calvin proving that the council and the consistory were of one mind, he hoped to avoid their censure. Of course, that didn't work, and his opponents were outraged. Sebastian Castellio, for example, condemned the execution in a series of treatises. More on that in a future episode. Suffice it to say that the Servetus affair did not help Calvin's popularity. So, was Calvin responsible for Servetus's execution? Not entirely. The council conducted its own investigation and ultimately decided on his death, but Calvin was, indeed, somewhere in the background and therefore shares some of the blame. He brought Servetus to the council's attention, and he mobilized his supporters in Zurich and Basel to give the council the right information. I want to learn more about Calvin's opponents in Geneva. These stories definitely deserve greater attention. Ultimately, it seems to me that the case wasn't really about Michael Servetus himself, but about what he represented to the various factions in Geneva. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy. Thank you, everyone.